Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. In case this is your first episode, let me quickly introduce myself. I am Narad Muni, and I am a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. And I am a traveling musician and a storyteller by profession. I used to walk around with a veena for several millennia, but podcasting has made my job so much easier. This week, by popular demand, we are doing another Vikram and Betaal story. Thank you for all the feedback I've received so far. If you haven't heard episode 5, I recommend you check that out. It's not strictly necessary, but it may be helpful. Don't worry though if you haven't. I'll give you a quick recap. You may associate this week's character with a couple of very famous movies, but the real story is very different. Now on to the show. There was once a wise king called Vikramaditya. Once, a rishi gave him a daily gift, a precious jewel disguised as a fruit. To repay the gifts, the king agreed to fulfill the rishi's simple wish of fetching him a Betaal from a crematorium. A Betaal is a reanimated corpse. The Betaal mostly loved hanging around in a tree by hanging down from it, like a bat. He did not want to be captured. The only way he could escape, though, was if the king said something. So the Betaal told stories to the king, and those stories were all lateral thinking puzzles that tricked the king into speaking. The king was smart enough to know the answer, but not smart enough to hold his tongue. There are 25 stories because Vikramaditya, though wise, doesn't learn from previous iterations. And the Betaal flies back to the same tree so he can be easily captured again and tell another story. This week, the story begins right after the last one. The Betaal was back in his tree again. Vik climbed the tree again, captured the Betaal again, and was carrying him to the rishi across the crematorium again. The Betaal started on the same premise. Hey, it's a long walk across the crematorium. Let me tell you a story to pass the time, he said. Vik knew better than to say anything, at least at this point in the story, because speaking would allow the Betaal to escape. But Vik had definitely liked the last story, so he may have subconsciously slowed down his walk to make sure the Betaal managed to finish it before they reached the other side. There was once a kingdom, the Betaal began. The king and queen were fair and wise rulers. They were very happy too. They had one daughter and they were very proud of her. She was a brilliant child, and not just academically. She had a perfect score on her SATs, and by that, I mean the sword fight aptitude test. She excelled in other kinds of physical education, archery in particular, but sword fighting was her specialty. Probably because this was a sport that fully exercised both her mental and physical abilities. And she wasn't being graded favorably by her teachers just because of who her parents were. She really was brilliant. She continued to win all the awards and medals at Princess School. Finally, when she got older, and the king and queen got even older, they all had a conversation about continuing their dynasty. Life expectancy being what it was back then, the king and queen were understandably worried. Yeah, makes sense, said the princess. Just as her parents' expression changed to relief, she added, But... Oh no, said the queen, don't tell us you want to go see the world first. Oh no, nothing like that, said the princess. I don't want to take risks when I'm the single point of failure here. I mean, what if I get bitten by a shark in the Great Barrier Reef? Or there's a hurricane in the Caribbean? No, I can do all that after I've had an heir and they are ready to take over the throne. Which brings us back to my condition. Great Barrier Reef, Caribbean, I never thought of those before, said the king, who was likely to be carried away by the smallest distraction. Turning to the queen, he said, I can have the royal travel agent plan us a good trip. Which brings us back to my condition, repeated the princess, a bit louder, so it snapped the king back to attention. My condition is simple. I alone will decide on the qualifications of my suitor. And by qualifications, I mean qualification, singular. All my suitor needs to do is to beat me in sword fight. Not that video game again, said the queen. I tell you, this way you'll never find anyone. Most princes don't sit around playing video games all day, you know. I don't mean the video game, I mean the real thing, said the princess. Oh my god, there's so much risk of getting hurt, said the queen. Don't worry, I can manage, replied the princess. Not you, dear, said the queen. I'm talking about the princess. You're good, and that's what I'm worried about. These are princes who are heirs to their throne. Their parents have been friends with us for decades. We can't risk souring our relationship. We can have them sign a disclaimer, though. There's a couple whom I wouldn't mind seeing with their noses in the ground, said the king. There's the one with the glasses who once thought I was the butler. I think we should invite him first. Yeah, disclaimer is good, said the princess. We can even make the parents sign it for underage princes. And I don't want a fight to the death, just until they yield, or until I disarm them. Even if you did find a person who can defeat you, you shouldn't marry your rival. You should marry the person who gives you tea and moral support before and after the fight, said the queen. If she had been born a few millennia later, she would have provided the example of Rocky Balboa's rivalry with Creed and his marriage to Adrian. But besides being agile at swordplay, the princess was great at verbal swordplay too. So she shut down this discussion the way that was guaranteed to work. Okay, boomer, she said. Fine, said the queen in exasperation. I don't see how this is going to get you a suitor, but let's try this. Don't worry, Mom, said the princess. A girl in Scotland is going to do this centuries from now, and Disney will even make a movie out of it. Narad himself told me, she added. I must confess, I actually did tell the princess about this. And so it was announced all over the known world. Thousands of princes showed up. Most of them were surprised that it was to be a real sword fight and not the video game. And that left the queen shaking her head at what the world was coming to. The princess decided to fight nevertheless, because their first instinct was it would be a sword fight against a girl. In most parts of the world then, people would be surprised if a girl could tell the difference between a sword and a spear. They went in expecting a quick fight. And a quick fight is exactly what they got. But the result was the opposite. The princess was amazing. She quickly defeated 14 princes before the first drinks break, all to loud cheers from the audience. Yes, this was a live performance. The king and queen found a way to monetize the situation and boost the treasury. Ticket prices at the stadium were 1 gold coin a pop, with extra gold coins for premium seats. And not to mention, concession stands that made a killing by selling popcorn and chips. And the public lapped it all up. All of the princesses' fights were sellout features. The queen came by during the drinks break and said, I don't think this is a good idea to continue this way. I agree with you, said the princess. We should make it an even fight. Maybe I should fight with one hand behind my back. Or maybe my head in a bag. Yeah, but for how long? Said the Queen. You youngsters just think short term. You might tire quickly and then lose to the weakest candidate out there. We should have daily limits so you have a chance to rest. And let's sort the candidates in some intelligent order instead of just first come first serve. Yeah, said the King, do the kid with the glasses first. And so they did. And you can bet the King cheered the loudest. This continued for a while. Princes came, they saw, and they were conquered. All except one. This prince, let's call him Uday, was a smart one who believed data is power. And no, he wasn't a Facebook or Google employee. Uday came and he saw, period. The way he went about collecting data was pretty much the same way Google and Facebook do, by embedding agents everywhere. He had his people hide in the crowd and observe the princess's footwork and her actions. He also disguised himself as a commoner and did some of the observation work himself. He collected and stored all the information in a huge database, his brain. Every day, as he watched the princess fight, he would also try and imagine which move would work well against her. Now, sword fighting or fencing was and remains a very chess-like game. You have to outthink your opponent and make all the right moves. The princess was brilliant at those things. And as it happens with any expert in any field, she had some signature moves. In particular, there was one that the princess used against a difficult opponent. The move was very clever, and no one who hadn't been intently watching the princess's rapid footwork would have understood it. Uday was watching intently, and so he did understand it. So when the princess defeated her opponent, Uday cheered the loudest, so much so that the princess saw him in the crowd. Anyway, when the supply of princes was beginning to run out, Uday finally decided he had enough information to fight the princess. He did, and for every one of her signature moves, he had a counter move. Finally, he managed to disarm the princess. This was a shock, and the crowd let out a collective gasp. In the end, when the princess saw Uday's face closely, she recognized him immediately as the person who cheered for her from the crowd. Uday may have been smart, but he was no master of disguise. "What were you doing in the crowd?" she asked, even though she already knew. Uday, who at this point was on cloud 9, didn't mind describing at great length all the opposition research he did, and his data intelligence strategy. He added at the end, "I played fair. There's nothing in the rules against this in all the disclaimers and agreements I signed. I read all the fine print, all 200 pages of it." The king and queen said to the princess, "He's right, you know. He played by the rules. He's a good catch. His data intelligence strategy could land him billions. An excellent startup idea," said the queen. "And he reads and understands fine print. He must be incredibly patient," said the king. "Nevertheless, I can't marry him," said the princess. Uday was known to be very logical too, and he caught on quicker than anyone else. "You're right," he said to the princess. "We can't be married." He bowed to the princess, the king, and the queen, and went back to his kingdom. "That's the story," said the Betaal. "I get that she had a huge ego, and that's why she chose not to marry Uday, despite him meeting her only condition. But why did Uday agree with her?" Vic knew why, of course. "First of all, stop making bad assumptions," he said. The princess's refusal to marry Uday was not because of her ego. She was just being plain logical. And Uday agreed because he agreed with her logic. The reason was actually a pretty simple one. By observing the princess every day and learning from her moves, Uday had in effect become her student. Their relationship was now that of a teacher and a student. And in medieval India, this was an extremely special relationship. To Indian youngsters back then, their father, mother, god, and teacher were all held in the highest regard. And then there was everyone else, including, your spouse and your kids. So the princess couldn't possibly marry her student, and he couldn't possibly marry his teacher. It was just cool logic. Did the princess find herself a suitor and later make her round the world trip? Asked Vic. Bro, it was just an imaginary princess, just a lateral thinking puzzle, said the Betaal. But if it makes you feel better, sure, she found someone. They continued their dynasty, and she went on several round the world trips. She's probably trekking through the Grand Canyon right now. But all that is besides the point. What matters is that you've been talking all this while, and that means... Vic didn't hear anything after that because the Betaal had escaped back to his tree. In a future episode, Vic will capture the Betaal again and hear another story. A note on the show. In some versions, the Betaal tells the king that if he knows the answer but doesn't say it, his head will explode. This is just an exaggeration. I mean, who heard of literal mind-blowing and not just figurative mind-blowing? The character this week is Bahubali. Now there's more than one version of Bahubali. It's a common name because Bahubali literally means strong-armed, as an adjective and not as a description of an action. Indian mythology has no shortage of strong-armed people. Bahubali could lift mountains and crush boulders with his bare hands. And no, he was not a superhero from the planet Krypton, and he was not the Hulk either. Bahubali is a figure from Jain mythology. He was born the son of a king and lived a life of luxury. Contrary to the movie, which is just a work of fiction anyway, Bahubali had 99 brothers. His oldest brother was to be king of Ayodhya, but Bahubali had a minor kingdom somewhere else, and his 98 brothers had their own lands too. The brother, Bharat, decided he wasn't completely satisfied until all his brothers submitted to him. 98 of them did and became monks. Bahubali didn't. Instead, they had a 3-round personal contest and not an all-out war. The 3 rounds were a staring contest, a water contest, and just plain old wrestling. Bahubali won all 3. But he was disgusted by what sibling rivalry had done to them. In a very Buddha moment, he decided to give up everything about his comfortable life, including his clothes, and to go and meditate. And so he did for 12 years without even moving. Finally, he attained moksha when his defeated brother Bharat came and prayed to him. This Bharat should not be confused with the one from the Ramayana, even though they both ruled Ayodhya. There's a huge stone statue of Bahubali in southern India, in a place called Shravanabelagola, which I will not attempt to pronounce again. It's one of the largest freestanding statues in the world, and it was built around 1,000 years ago. There are some pictures of the statue linked from the website. Check those out. The statue and most others show him with creepers growing around his legs. Pretty logical considering Bahubali didn't move for 12 years. Next week, we are going to do an Akbar and Birbal episode. The setup might remind you of Tenali Raman, but it's actually rather different. The character next week is a boar, but definitely not a boar that Asterix and Obelix would be able to hunt, because this boar is actually a god in disguise. It can swim and fly and change size. Some people have speculated that it might actually be a rhinoceros, but that's all it is, just a speculation. Since I'm several thousands of years old, my memory may not be perfect at times. So if you see any errors in my podcast, I'd appreciate it if you could point them out to me. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can leave a review on the site. It's sfipodcast.com. The site is also linked in the show notes. You can also tweet at sfipodcast. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. As always, I am grateful to family and friends for all the support and help. And thank you all for listening. The feedback I have received has been very useful. I'll see you next week.